Welcome to Duke Fuqua Insights, a podcast where we explore faculty research and the actionable takeaways for business leaders at every level.
Hello there, my name is Scott Dyring, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Innovation at the Fuqua School of Business. Today, I'm joined by Professor Tong Guo, Associate Professor of Marketing at Fuqua and Duke's Department of Economics, as well as a faculty affiliate at the Duke Margolis Center of Health Policy. Her research focuses on the causal role of information in marketing and its policy implications, especially for healthcare, new technology, and consumer protection. In this episode, we'll explore her research on the unintended consequences of the Sunshine Act, revealing how well-intentioned policies can have complex effects in the real world. Tong, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me today.
So let's start with the big picture. What prompted you to study the Sunshine Act's disclosure rules?
Yeah, I've always been very intrigued by how complex the whole industry of healthcare is, especially given so many different parties are involved in making the decisions for everybody, for patients, for doctors, and for hospitals. At the same time, we probably would notice there's so much money invested in the whole discipline. Surprisingly, as the first impression, some area like healthcare should be an area with heavy investment into R&D. But quite contrary to many layman beliefs, the top expenditure goes to marketing. So during my graduate study, I was caught by this very shocking phenomenon in this discipline, and I wonder how does the money move the needles around in this discipline. And therefore, I decided to dedicate much of my graduate studies towards understanding healthcare marketing. In particular, regulators have noticed that there's so much expenditure in this domain involved with paying towards physicians, and they come up with this so-called Sunshine Act, which aim at disclosing every details between medical device and pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers. That's basically the initial motivations of why I started looking into the regulations in this domain. And as I spend more time and effort studying this area, the more I realize so much unintended things are going on with this well-intentioned policy.
Yeah, very interesting. One of your key findings is that, on average, payments to doctors did not decrease, but that there's a deeper story. Can you walk us through why the average masks some of the big differences underneath?
Sure. First of all, I do want to give this disclaimer that much of these expenditures reported under Sunshine Act are considered legal. So they are fine. And they're not in cash payment for the most part. They're mostly sponsorship for events, conference travels, informational presentations, and things like that. So much of these payments are legal, and therefore it's natural that it doesn't come with much of a pressure to cut it down. In addition, many of these companies build their marketing budget at the beginning of the marketing cycle, usually annually. So the budget would work as a whole, and it doesn't involve too much of a personalization towards individual relationships. That's why, on average, there is very little reason to expect a huge change on the payment because of a simple transparency law. However, as we dig deeper, it seems that firms do have more capability to make use of this piece of information after transparency law. They can further optimize across all the relationships they maintain with healthcare practitioners. That's why if you allow a little fine-grained analysis of the individual changes, we do detect some differences, some changes before and after that Sunshine Act. But still, going back to the initial point, given the payments are all legal and they're mostly events-driven, it's very hard to imagine how, on average, the payment would change significantly because of the simple regulation.
Yeah. Okay, great. So on average, they don't change, but you do find that some payments actually increase for expensive drugs and top prescribing physicians. What does that tell us about how pharmaceutical firms responded to the new transparency measures?
Yeah, this is, as I mentioned earlier on, this is a very nice continuation of what we've been discussing, for firms, the number one rule for them to run their business is always to think about their ROI model. So they will take all measures, exploit all resources to make good use of the marketing information so that they could improve their ROI. Part of this transparency regulation gives them this necessary information they can optimize on. So they have information about who their competitors are reaching out to, for what reasons, during which time period. That allows them to further maximize their returns on their existing relationships that they manage. That's why they know maybe by tweaking a little bit of my marketing dollars towards more influential physicians, it will pay me even more. Therefore, we see this increased payments towards more expensive drugs and top prescribing physicians, all because they give them even more. They give firms even more ROI. So, in a nutshell, all the firms just work with their ROI model to bet their money on the most rewarding partners.
Your analysis relies very heavily on machine learning, specifically a method called causal forests. For those of us who are not data scientists, can you explain what causal forests do and why they were the right tool for this study?
That's a very important question when we think about leveraging all these new technologies and tools coming from machine learning and AI. So a simple summary of what causal forest can do for us is that we can capture fine-grained treatment effect over and above the average treatment effect usually people look at in these experimental studies. For causal forest, when it allows us to speak a little more carefully about individual relationships, in my case, between firms and physicians. I think they're the perfect tool for this study because, as I said, on average, you don't theoretically, empirically, you don't have a strong reason to expect a huge change on average. So what matters more is how firms reallocate their marketing resources towards different partners, and capturing that uneven change across different relationships is really important. And causal forest offers that capability to capture the heterogeneity in the changes. And with the academic word, it's called heterogeneous treatment effect.
Yeah, very cool. In an era where AI and data transparency are reshaping many industries, what lessons does this research offer about the promises and limitations of using machine learning in policy evaluation?
First and foremost, as I mentioned to the previous question, causal forest, as an example of such AI tools, are super powerful in helping us understanding the fine-grained changes due to any policy intervention. That's the most immediate benefit if we think about using AI and machine learning tools to understanding policy's impact. On the other hand, what I think would be crucial whenever we apply AI or machine learning tools to our analysis is to always remember you need a human mind behind all those analyses. Yes, with state-of-the-art statistical and machine learning tools, you can capture more fine-grained data pattern. But how to interpret these patterns? What do they really mean? What is the most prioritized questions and issues that you want to sort out? And how to incorporate those data pattern and takeaways into your decision making? It's always a decision left to human instead of AI. So I think it's a huge limitation to all these AI tools, to also a risk to all these AI tools, to fully relying on AI tools to make decisions automatically without human consideration.
Yeah, very, very interesting. We have many MBA students here, obviously, at the Fuqua School of Business. How should an MBA student think about the unintended consequences of transparency policies like public disclosure payments in industries where they might end up working or leading teams?
That's a great question. I would say this public disclosure or any transparency regulations really applies to industries beyond healthcare. You nowadays see similar disclosure regulations almost everywhere. If we think about an MBA student who wants to be a TikTok influencer and he happens to receive some sponsorships from brands, he has to disclose all those brand sponsorships as well for every sponsored videos. So public disclosure regulations really applies to areas way beyond healthcare. How should we think about the unintended consequences? First of all, transparency regulations would not necessarily lead to drastic changes of how people practice their business. But it's also always important for whoever's involved in this practice to be clear about who else are involved in the whole process and how would they use this piece of information that getting disclosed. Different parties would have different capabilities of leveraging the power of fuller information, and therefore that might create a different comparative advantage or disadvantage. So for our MBA students, it might be useful to think about who else are getting these pieces of information and the ways they're using the information. It's also a lesson for them to reflect on themselves.
Tong, thank you so much for joining me today and chatting about your very fascinating study.
Thank you so much.
Duke Fuqua Insights is produced by the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. You can learn more at fuqua.duke.edu/podcast.